I didn't have an opening for this video. Boo! I hope we can all agree that making fun of or being overly judgmental about what another person likes is generally unproductive and not okay, or just plain rude. You shouldn't make fun of the clothes people wear or the hobbies they participate in. Unless they're playing pickleball in an SS uniform or something. A bunch of pearl-clutching Puritans went after heavy metal in the 80s and then violent video games in the 90s, making the argument that those things must mean something is fundamentally wrong with anyone who enjoys those forms of art, or that it would lead to real-world violence. This was obviously proven false, and may have honestly led to the proliferation of more violence in video games and music that sounds like a symphony of chainsaws made of pure hate. Or a combination of both. But some people still maintain that kind of mindset, I suspect because social conditioning is a pretty powerful tool of censorship.
I have to break my silence. There is something fundamentally wrong with you if you love horror movies. I've really been holding my tongue on this for a long time. Why do you want to be scared all the time? Why do you like gore? Why do you want to see blood and guts on screen when you could watch something nice? You don't even have to feel nice when you watch stuff. You can, you can...
Now, before I respond to this creator, let's talk a bit about horror movies since it is spooky season. Horror movies are probably the most misunderstood genre, and it makes sense. Horror movies tend to explore themes that trigger a person's fight or flight response, and we willingly sit down with a bucket of popcorn and do it to ourselves just for the rush. But as with any genre, that exploration can be a catalyst for release or allow us to reframe certain themes in a way that other genres can. And there's nothing wrong with not enjoying or understanding horror, just like there's nothing wrong with being, let's say, confusingly aroused and excited as a 13-year-old boy by Linnea Quigley getting eaten by zombies. Not everything is made for everyone, and how could it be? I'm personally pretty picky about my horror, and it has to hit a particular tone and have something to say, like how The Thing is about paranoia and the AIDS epidemic, and The Babadook is about parenting and grief. That being said, it doesn't always have to have some kind of subtext, but if it doesn't, it should at least be fun and campy and have some pretty impressive practical effects. Chopping Mall or Ghoulies aren't exactly saying anything and were probably made just as an excuse to blow up a fake head full of blood and play with adorably monstrous puppets. Sometimes the intriguing parts of horror aren't anything to do with the subtext, but in their visuals, like the lighting and camera work in Italian giallo movies that hit you in a way you can't emotionally articulate. And that's the cool thing about horror. Its fantastical and ludicrous premises invite allegory and metaphor in a way other genres don't or can't. Going back and looking at the evolution of horror over the decades, many horror films were as much about a literal monster as they were about a figurative one. In fact, early horror films were based on things like folklore and superstition and religion, all things that used allegory as a tool to teach some kind of moral lesson. Many horror films have some kind of subtextual theme. Psycho is a psychoanalytical thriller about hopelessness and corruption. Invasion of the Body Snatchers is about McCarthyism, of all things. The Shining is about masculinity, sexism, corporate America, racism, and maybe the plight of the Native American, and also the Holocaust. There's a lot in that one. Dracula and Nosferatu, the movie that is heavily inspired by the novel that cemented horror as a genre, is widely considered to be about transgressive sexuality, fears about invasion, and Victorian anxieties about disease. It was also pretty anti-Semitic, which isn't great, but it was still more than just about a gay Dracula sucking other men dry for the hell of it. Modern horror films are just as cerebral and metaphorical. The best examples are pretty much any Jordan Peele horror movie. Get Out is a criticism of colorblindness and neoliberalism. Us is about classism and marginalization. And Nope examines spectacle and exploitation. As spooky as the monsters are in these movies, they all have something more to offer than simple jump scares. They're cerebral and intriguing in a way rom-coms or action movies rarely are. Not to say those genres can't say something or be subversive themselves, but there isn't as much room for allegory and symbolism in them as much as horror allows, because they lack the fantastical unreality of horror, where there are ghosts and specters and zombies and radioactive monster men doing their best Charles Foster Kane impression. And yet, horror movies are often dismissed as being schlock or gratuitous gore, which they absolutely can be, but that's because fake blood and rubber knives are cheap and the movies themselves can be made with a limited crew. Daniel Myrick and Eduardo Sanchez weren't exactly making Star Wars when they did the Blair Witch Project. Typically, people don't want to come to terms with their own mortality, and on the surface, horror typically deals with death or dying, and also being brutally murdered or dismembered or melted by a giant blob. Fear is our body's way of warning us that something is horribly wrong. So why do so many people enjoy horror movies that depict frightening images? Because horror gives us a safe space to confront those fears, whether they're rooted in something as personal as grief or as universal as the fear of death. There's something deeply human about grappling with the unknown, and horror lets us do that from the comfort of a theater or our couch while we simultaneously scroll through IMDb reading trivia about how Fede Alvarez used 50,000 gallons of fake blood on the set of the Evil Dead remake while watching the Evil Dead remake. It's a controlled experience where we can explore the unsettling and terrifying, and then when the credits roll, we're still alive and safe. Horror is often about survival and characters facing their worst fears and either succumbing or overcoming them. Watching horror can be empowering because it reminds us that even in the worst situations, people can persevere. However, there are a lot of folks who simply don't or can't see that about horror movies, who have boring, tired takes and think that if you enjoy horror, you're mentally deranged.
I have to break my silence. There is something fundamentally wrong with you if you love horror movies.
I have no idea who this person is, but their TikTok account says they're a comedian and shit talker. And I can tell you right now, only one of those things is true. I've omitted their username because I don't want to encourage anyone to go find and harass them, because they've gotten plenty of that already. I'm just using them as an example of how common these kinds of misconceptions are and how judgmental and myopic people can be. This creator hit pretty much every dumb, tone-deaf talking point in just a couple of videos.
There is something fundamentally wrong with you. Why do you want to be scared all the time? Why do you want to see blood and guts on screen? Violence porn? And it's become so mainstream. People are like, I love horror movies. Why? Why do you like that? That's fucking weird. I can't.
Maybe I'm too optimistic, but I thought we'd progress beyond this kind of unconstructive judgment in the year 2024, and we're cool with people liking what they like, free of criticism. They popped up on my For You page a couple weeks back and got absolutely ratioed by stitches and comments. The thing I love is that it starts with, I'm breaking my silence, like they're about to crack open some government conspiracy.
I have to break my silence.
No one was waiting with bated breath that a random, self-important internet comedian was gonna break their silence and give some idiotic opinion about horror movies. The worst part is, they're just parroting the same talking points people have been using to describe horror for decades. Arguments that could be applied to literally any other genre. Why do you like rom-coms? They're formulaic, unrealistic portrayals of relationships that perpetuate shallow ideas about love and happiness, relying on outdated sexist tropes that reduce women down to one-dimensional characters whose primary goal is finding a man where love is as simple as a quirky meet-cute or a grand gesture, completely glossing over the complexities of real human relationships, that panders to stereotypical fantasies, reinforcing the idea that women are incomplete without romance or children, or that a successful relationship magically fixes all personal issues through toxic, manipulative behavior, painted as charming or romantic, ultimately creating harmful narratives about what love is supposed to look like. Not so nice now, is it? Now, would I ever seriously get online and say any of that unironically? No, because it's just a movie, and rom-coms can have a similar catharsis to horror. So what are we even talking about? People enjoy all kinds of things that might seem weird or unpleasant on the surface, but that doesn't mean there's something wrong with them. This person goes on to say that you don't have to watch something nice, you could watch something that's emotionally heartbreaking, as if that's not harder for some people to deal with than seeing a horrific tentacled dog beast that they know is obviously fake. Personally, sad movies have a real effect on me, whereas I can go about my day after watching a horror movie. I mean, I waited like 3 years to finally muster up the courage to watch Moonlight. Also, fear and sadness aren't mutually exclusive. Many of the horror films I've mentioned deal with some kind of sadness or grief where no one gets impaled like a Capri Sun and has all their blood and guts and skeleton exploded. Do they think that all horror movies are snuff? Wait, hang on. Do they think that actors in horror movies are actually getting murdered? Do they not know what fiction is? And this is where things take a real turn.
You want me to come over to your house, me a woman, you a man, famously violent murderers as a genre. You want me to come to you, a strange man's house, and watch violence porn? And then kiss?
Yeah, let's generalize all men, insinuate that if a man does like Friday the 13th, they're more of a threat, and call horror violence porn. Not only does this sound wildly misandrist, there are women who like horror as well. I mean, Elvira is like the original big titty goth girl and poster woman of horror, for fuck's sake. Besides that, horror can be empowering for female audiences, where characters like Laurie Strode from Halloween or Ellen Ripley from Alien challenge the traditional damsel in distress stereotype by being active participants in their own stories, subverting gender roles. Horror films can also tap into real fears and anxieties women face, including violence, sexual assault, and the social pressure to act as caregiver and incubator. Like I mentioned earlier, The Babadook is about motherhood and grief, while a movie like Midsummer eerily juxtaposes its themes of toxic relationships and emotional manipulation, and scenes of graphic head crushings and immolation with a color palette more appropriate for a Hallmark movie. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, ladies, but these kinds of movies seem like they can give women the space to confront and process these themes in a symbolic way and offer catharsis and a sense of control over fears. I assume. It's probably one of the reasons true crime podcasts are so popular with women. They can feel a sense of recognition or validation granted by these stories. Now, I can't say all that without addressing the fact that not all horror movies provide this catharsis or are handled with care most of the time. Women in horror films do tend to be unnecessarily nude and murdered in ways that could be interpreted as just a straight-up hatred of women, typically when it comes to slasher movies. But this is what's called a nuanced take, something this creator lacks entirely. I can recognize the genre isn't a monolith and is a vast landscape full of subgenres and tones and good and bad and cynical crap. But so is every other genre. There are horror romance movies, horror comedies, psychological horrors, and yes, also blood and guts horror.
You want me to come to you, a strange man's house, and watch violence porn? And then kiss? It's not gonna work for me.
Just admit that you think video game violence leads to real-world violence, or that people who play Dungeons and Dragons are actual wizards who summon real demons. It's basically the same thing. It's so weird to see someone so passionately hate something they do not have to participate in, and where no one is forcing them to. Whatever the opposite of pick-me behavior is, this is it. Going out of your way to be the most insufferable, close-minded person on the planet for no real reason, and with no evidence to back up your claim.
And it's become so mainstream. People are like, I love horror movies. Why? Not even suspense or thriller. Horror. I cannot get behind this. I will not get behind it.
Horror has been around since the 1930s. What are you talking about? Every genre goes through waves of popularity, and this take makes me wonder if they understand how cultural trends work. Like, superhero movies didn't used to be mainstream and were actually looked down upon until Robert Downey Jr. made them cool. And now we're all tired of them, and that popularity has waned. Ironically, also thanks to Robert Downey Jr. The peak of horror popularity was arguably the late 70s, followed by a bit of a downturn in the 80s with a bunch of cheap slasher films that are kind of cult classics now, and then another slump, only for teen horror movies to make a comeback a decade later. So I'm not sure what point they're making here besides suggesting it's some kind of systemic problem that's corrupting the youth. Okay, Nancy Reagan. Can you imagine someone saying this in regards to Westerns in the 1950s? I just can't get behind the glorification of emotionally distant men in 10-gallon hats and unchecked masculinity that's essentially an allegory promoting U.S. imperialism, manifest destiny, and the subjugation of the American West. Hey, what did I tell you? Get back in the kitchen!
Why do you like that? That's fucking weird. I can't.
You don't have to understand why someone likes horror, or anything for that matter. Are you a psychologist or a sociologist? This is the pop psychobabble shit I'm so tired of that internet bozos have gotten way too comfortable applying with authority. Another common thing that happens with dipshit takes like this is that people go out of their way to make this non-issue exclusively about them, which obviously pisses a lot of people off. It pissed me off enough to make a video about it because horror and anything labeled dark is often the subject of unfair criticism just because it's considered taboo by society's standards, and society often gets things wrong in terms of what is acceptable and proper. Historically, anything that deals with darkness, violence, or death has been labeled as dangerous or subversive in a way that might corrupt the children. Oh, the children! Heavy metal, just like horror, has been written off as angry or violent for decades, despite being a genre that offers people a way to channel intense emotions and confront societal issues like a rage room for your ears. Hardcore punk and metal often carry anti-establishment, pro-community messaging, and any mention of Satanism is usually expressed in concept albums about a Frank Frazetta fantasy world where a barbarian fights mythical dragons. Not that you should go home and self-harm in order to meet Beelzebub. These forms of art are only considered threatening because they push boundaries and force people to confront things they'd rather ignore. Metalheads and horror fans refuse to be docile, malignant consumers of nice, inoffensive art. The whole purpose of art is to elicit emotions of revulsion, or reflection, or dread, or hope, or fucking anything at all. Otherwise, it's not doing its job and is boring. Like a paperweight just existing. Also, horror movies tend to be more funny than actually scary or repulsive, especially if you're familiar with the tropes and cliches. One of the things that makes something funny is its incongruity or surprise. We laugh at something horrific because it's unexpected or absurd, and there's no way someone's head could possibly actually do that, right? Horror often builds tension, and when the release finally happens, laughter is a way to process that tension. It's also a kind of defense mechanism that helps audiences distance themselves from the horrific things they're seeing. We all know what a nervous laugh is, right? The more over-the-top or unrealistic something is, the more it veers into the absurd, making it funny rather than terrifying. Normally, what would happen to a person with such a horrible take is that they would eventually delete it after enough people called them out. But not this person. They doubled down and then tripled down.
I fear my take may not have been strong enough. Horror fans are proving themselves even more insufferable than previously thought in my comments. They are ratioing me to hell because they're angry that I don't like what they like.
They're not insufferable or angry because you don't like what they like. They're calling you out for saying liking a kind of movie means your brain is broken and you might murder women.
The media literacy is at an all-time low. Like, horror fans are so, like, the TikTok generation, clearly. Everyone's like, how would you like it if I said that I didn't like the art behind you? I would say, okay, well, it's in my house. So it actually doesn't matter at all. They're so pressed. Insufferable people, all of you. Why do you care? I'm talking shit.
Bruh. The cognitive dissonance of saying horror fans are suffering from a lack of media literacy and TikTok brain rot, all while giving a TikTok brain rot opinion that lacks media literacy, is astounding, dude. You couldn't be less self-aware or more arrogant and dismissive. They then go on to continue calling horror violence porn and trying to psychoanalyze people who watch it as having some kind of unresolved trauma.
This is probably the last video I'll make on this because y'all are really having a problem with me, and that's okay.
I mean, it really doesn't seem like it's okay, but go on.
You've tried to educate me in the comments. And by educate, I mean you've called me fat, ugly, boring, unfunny, homophobic, racist, unsafe for autistic people, and a lot of other unfounded things. The fat one is founded. I hope that the people who are in the comments saying, actually, horror fans are some of the nicest people I've ever met in my life. I would like you to go back through my videos and read the comments. And you know what? What I hope is that you seek me out in the street. You already called me Andre the Giant, and you're right. Would you like to have this conversation in person?
So obviously doing any of that is bad and unacceptable, and no one should go seek them out or harass them on other platforms. But even while they're detailing their bullying, they still cannot help themselves from continuing to insult an entire demographic of people and suggesting all the people commenting represent all horror fans, and then threatening to fight them in the street. There's nothing that makes you look more weak and defeated than posturing as a tough guy on the internet. You know what else makes it look like you lost an argument? Backtracking.
I think what you should do is go back to watching your weird fucking slasher films. And listen, if my video offended you and the shoe fits, look inward. But if you were one of the people who saw the video and was like, yeah, I do have a lot of trauma, it is kind of odd that I find soothing in horror movies. That was the original intention. You misread it, and that's okay. You know, that's one of the risks we run when we put videos on the internet.
Oh, we misunderstood, everyone. Our bad. Well, wrap it up. Everybody, time to go home. I'm sorry, but you didn't mince words. You were very clear in the original video that you think horror fans are twisted weirdos or whatever. You just said it 2 seconds ago in this last response video. You know what else you risk by putting videos on the internet? Getting absolutely dragged when you say something wildly unfounded and moronic, and then getting corrected and or clowned on. It's a two-way street, baby. I can't believe people are mad at me about how mean I was.
So I'm really not pressed, but you guys are. And yeah, I just really encourage you to think about how you treat other people on the internet. I have been a fat woman on the internet for over a decade, far over a decade. So I'm really thick-skinned. A lot of people have said some really heinous shit to me on the internet. And I slept really soundly last night. Like, you guys aren't doing it for me. But I do hope you treat other people with a little bit more kindness.
Dude, you've made multiple videos unfairly calling people out. You seem pretty pressed and that they did in fact get under your skin. Am I being fucking gaslit here? Just because you say something doesn't mean it's true, and doubling down rather than ignoring the backlash just proves it's not. True, that is.
You really, for real, don't have to engage. And a lot of you have spent hours in the comments arguing and calling me really mean names, and there just really isn't a reason for that. I was doing a haha funny and you didn't like it, and that's gonna be okay. I hope that you find some peace. And ultimately, I love you dearly.
Look, to be somewhat sensitive, I don't doubt that this person has received more than their fair share of harassment and bullying. The internet fucking sucks. But these responses really started to feel like someone weaponizing their own mistreatment and using eye for an eye as justification to be a bully themselves. And it's really rich to pull the empathy card after all that. This whole series of videos of absolutely abysmal takes could just be millennial rage bait, but the fact that they simultaneously respond to being harassed and in the same breath continue to talk shit themselves, I'm not sure what to think. Unless they're using the harassment they received to make more rage bait, but that can't be. No one's that craven. Hot takes are fine most of the time, like how some people like pineapple on pizza or prefer hot weather to cold weather. Those opinions aren't hurting anyone or painting an entire group of people with a broad brush. It's when they're tone deaf and uphold archaic thoughts that can be damaging because they lack nuance and reduce complex subjects to simplistic moral judgments. When someone dismisses horror or any art that deals with darker themes as inherently bad or violent, they perpetuate outdated social standards of decency that don't take into account the ways art helps people process trauma, or confront societal issues, or explore emotions in a safe, controlled environment. This kind of blanket criticism shuts down important conversation and reinforces harmful taboos that prevent people from engaging with art in any meaningful way. It also stigmatizes those who enjoy these forms of art by suggesting that something is wrong with them, which can be alienating and damaging, which is a real bummer coming from someone who talks openly about being bullied and harassed and, I assume, alienated themselves. Fuck, now I'm psychoanalyzing. Nuance is really important when discussing anything that pushes boundaries. Otherwise, it becomes a regressive take that's rooted in the fear of what's different or uncomfortable. Horror movies fucking rule, and if you can't see how they're impactful and meaningful, then that's fine. But maybe next time, instead of shitting on an entire community of people because your tastes don't align, try saying something like, hey, that's cool that you like that, or... That's the video. Thanks so much for sticking around. If you made it this far, that means you are special and spooky, because it's that time of year. Now, you know what I'm going to say. You got to follow the rules of the channel, and you got to like and comment and share and subscribe. If you do all of those things, or most of them, it would really help the channel out. You can also go follow me on Instagram, where I post updates about the channel, and memes, and just some stuff that I find outside that's, like, cool. That I think is cool, if you're interested in that sort of thing. Anyway, that's the video. Thanks so much for sticking around. Until next time, vanish. Ah!